remember distinctly being in the car driving to my office and listening to the voice of the late Peter Jennings on a radio broadcast when the towers collapsed. And immediately thinking to myself, everything has just changed. Suddenly there was going to be much more scrutiny on what we might think of as anti-American rhetoric. When country music decided that they no longer wanted to play the Dixie Chicks, for all intents and purposes, the Dixie Chicks disappear. And it becomes a lesson for how this new shifting terrain post 9/11, would impact what kinds of things artists felt compelled and free to talk about. They had been very critical of the presidency of George Bush. They themselves were from the state of Texas, so they knew, George W. Bush from his years as governor of the state of Texas. And the backlash that they faced, particularly amongst country radio stations, right? And this is a very different moment, in terms of media. There are no live streaming channels. There's no Pandora. There's no Apple. There's no iTunes yet. So this is a very different moment. And so artists absolutely needed traditional terrestrial radio stations. So the backlash was immediate. You saw elements of that backlash 2 years later. That I would say is still related to 9/11 in the aftermath of what's happening around Katrina in New Orleans and Kanye West's statements.
If you see a black family, it says they're looting.
In response to the federal government not really responding to the needs of the citizens on the ground in New Orleans. And he says, on an NBC telethon, George Bush doesn't care about black people.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
There were real fears, because of those statements that he would not commercially recover because radio would stop playing him and what have you.
We at war.
But by that time, we start to see a shift in the media landscape. There is much more content. The content flows much more freely. And so thus artists have a certain kind of freedom to make critiques. By the time we start to see the emergence of streaming music services, those kind of controls and constraints are not quite the same, right? So you have artists who have a certain amount of freedom now to engage politically, both in terms of mainstream artists and underground artists, that was not necessarily the case, before or clearly after 9/11. You don't see as many references to 9/11 now. I mean, when you think about what drives the popular music industry these days, if you think of an artist like Ariana Grande, these are folks who are 19, 20, 21 years old. They only know 9/11 from documentaries that they watch. So I think for young recording artists, right, the folks who are really driving the music industry right now, 9/11 is not an immediate reference. I think when you look at an artist like Bruce Springsteen, who of course has had a long history of doing socially conscious music, I think for an older guard of artists, right, who have had to recalibrate since 2001 because of 9/11, even if it's not something they directly reference in their music, it has become part of their practice, if you will, right? To be able to consider, how do they talk about these very difficult political issues